Good afternoon. Chairman Montepe, distinguished Churchill Fellows, and fellow Churchillians. My name is Michael Bishop, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and Director of the National Churchill Library and Center at the George Washington University. It is a particular honor for me to address you from this place, so near the spot where Winston Churchill spoke before a Westminster College audience at what he called a solemn moment for American democracy. Last October, at perhaps another such solemn moment, or at least an interesting one, the Churchill Center and the National Churchill Museum entered into an alliance to create a new entity, the International Churchill Society, based in Washington, D.C. The Society is dedicated to preserving and promoting the historic legacy of Sir Winston Churchill, and its activities and programs are conducted through the National Churchill Library and Center and the National Churchill Museum. We will share our research and programming resources, and items from Fulton's superb collection will be loaned on a rotating basis for display in Washington. We can do much more together than we can do alone. This alliance will help us better carry out our mission of not only preserving the past, but also shaping the present and the future. Our goal is to apply the lessons of Churchill's life and legacy to the challenges of today. To that end, we have welcomed, and will continue to welcome, both here and in Washington, historians, world leaders, foreign policy experts, and others, who will show that many of the concerns that consumed Churchill consume us still, and that his statesmanship and literary genius can and should guide and inspire us. Our new website, www.winstonchurchill.org, is the most comprehensive source on the internet for information about Churchill's life and career. Visitors can also learn about the events and scholarly endeavors taking place at both the library and the museum, and about the 34th International Churchill Conference on October 10th through 12th at the historic Essex House in New York. We have assembled a glittering lineup of speakers, and I hope that many of you will join us. In his 1940 eulogy for Neville Chamberlain, Churchill observed, "History with its flickering lamp stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days." Together, in Washington and in Fulton, I trust we will make the lamp of history shine far brighter and thus illuminate the path forward. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Back in December, Tim Riley called me to ask if I would introduce General Petraeus at this afternoon's conversation. And being a fan of Winston Churchill and having known General Petraeus for almost 25 years, the answer was an immediate yes. But I must tell you, the past several days, I have struggled to decide how you introduce someone of General Petraeus' stature. He is probably the best known admiral or general in any military service in any nation in the world in the 21st century. Holds a very, very high stature. When I thought about introducing him, one theme continued to come to mind, and that was 9/11. Now, I know many of you are thinking about September 11th of 2001 when that horrible terrorist attack took place that took the lives of many Americans and others. But I'm referring to that three-digit telephone number that we dial when something has to be done quickly, it has to be done right, and it has to yield long-term effects. A number of occasions, General Petraeus' phone has rang on some of those calls. I recall in late 2006, when the sectarian violence in Iraq was at its peak, the insurgency was growing, we were losing many American lives, a decision was made to install a new commander of multinational forces Iraq. General Petraeus and his family were driving one Saturday or Sunday, and his phone rang. And it was the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dr. Robert Gates, who called and said that he had recommended to President George W. Bush that he install General Petraeus as the next commander of NMFI. And of course, about 2 hours later, the phone rang again, and it was the White House Communications Office connecting President Bush and General Petraeus to go to Iraq and make a significant difference. In June of 2010, a decision was made to install a new commander in Afghanistan. General Petraeus was summoned to Washington, D.C. for a meeting with the president. He goes into a meeting with President Obama, and 45 minutes later, they were standing in the Rose Garden, and General Petraeus was being announced as the next commander of the International Security Force in Afghanistan. Now, one bit of trivia. General Petraeus' wife, Holly, learned about that new appointment from a friend who saw it on CNN. Because he went to Washington for a meeting with no topic, was offered a job, the job was accepted, and he tried to call her a couple of times, and she was away. But when something hard has to be done, it has to be done right, it has to be done quickly, Dave Petraeus' telephone number rings. Now, I've been tasked to introduce him today. I know we have 75 minutes for today's conversation. If I were to read his entire biography, it would take about half of that time. But I won't do that to you all this afternoon. But we know we have a person today who has served successfully in the military, has excelled in every position he has held, has led 6 different general officer commands, 5 in combat. He made a huge difference in leading our nation's flagship intelligence agency, the CIA, for a couple of years. He's very active today in corporate America and the private investing area. But most importantly, he gives back. He's also on the board of 10 separate veteran services organizations and comes to events like this to meet with college students and people like us to share his experience. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored this afternoon to introduce to you General David H. Petraeus.
Thank you. I'm not sure my mic is on. Is it come on? Thank you very much, Byron. And is my microphone on? It is. This is not like the start of that House Armed Services Committee where they said, General, and now your testimony, and the mic was dead. I do want to thank you for a very kind introduction. I want to thank you all for the invitation to be here. It is truly a privilege to be back in this wonderful campus. I was first here back in 2006, in fact, a few months, I think, before being asked to go back to Iraq for the 3rd time to lead the surge. I had a splendid time here at that time. I drew enormous inspiration and energy and instruction, really, from the museum. We stayed there so long that people were pulling up my sleeve. It's a privilege to follow one of America's truly greatest historians, John Meacham, someone who you heard is again not just a great historian and student of the presidency in particular, but is truly eloquent, is one of those I think we would describe as a literary lyricist. And he also has a delightful sense of humor, as we heard. And, you know, qualities, obviously, that Churchill in his own way embodied so magnificently, in which we'll have a chance to reflect on here today. And finally, Tim, thanks for taking the helm of this jewel, this national asset, this international asset, really, for continuing to build on what's been done here before. So impressive when you think about, again, rebuilding stone by stone and the genius of having this on top of the museum, and a true game changer, needless to say, for a small, great liberal arts school in the Midwest, that this is as they say in the financial community, this is a differentiator. And it's wonderful to see so many people come here each year to celebrate it. Indeed, the words, again, that you had, if I could, John, where you talked about celebrating, commemorating, and learning. That is hugely important, and we'll try to facilitate that a little further with our conversation here today.
Yes. Well, thank you, and for those kind words, and I'd like to echo those who have said before, welcome back to Westminster College.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
Let's start with Winston Churchill.
Sure.
In his Iron Curtain speech here 71 years ago, Churchill warned of the looming Soviet threat in post-World War II European landscape. He called for the United States and its allies in the English-speaking world, namely Great Britain and Canada, to stand firm against Soviet aggression. And that policy was not immediately a popular one, but it proved to shape the policy that would ultimately cause the Soviet Union to collapse. And I'm curious to know, given your worldview, what are the Iron Curtains of today?
Well, there are a number of them, and it appears that one has just descended again. For those who heard President Putin's spokesman on the news yesterday, I think a morning Joe probably, right after John held forth, it was quite chilling, actually. He used the term the Cold War again, and said it was even more chilly than perhaps it was before. I do think this is a little bit of rhetorical excess, to put it mildly. The Russia of today is not the Soviet Union of yesterday, but still it is a very formidable force, and it has a very formidable leader, one with whom we do not share every interest, to put it mildly, even though there are a few that converge, but most that conflict. So that certainly is a place where there is a bit of a Cold War, perhaps a bit of a descent of the Iron Curtain. Certainly there is some kind of Persian carpet that is descending out in the Middle East, where Iran is carrying out a variety of malign activities that appear to be designed to increase the Iranian control of the Shia areas in the Middle East, to solidify the so-called Shia Crescent, to in fact get a ground line of communications that goes all the way from Tehran, north of Baghdad, up the Tigris, over and then south and into Lebanon, eventually bypassing Damascus. Very troubling for our Gulf Arab allies, very concerning for our Israeli allies as well. And so again, I think another situation that bears very careful watching. There may be a bamboo curtain out there, albeit one that's very permeable, because through it flows the greatest amount of trade from the United States to any other trading partner. But certainly China is the country with whom we have the most important relationship, without question, and it will grow even more important in the years ahead as China continues its inexorable, I think, or very likely to be continued, rise relative to the United States. It should. 1.3 billion people at some point in time probably can produce a greater gross domestic product than can a country of 330 or 340 million, as remarkable as our country is. But that's the relationship that matters. Again, it is the biggest trading relationship for the United States in the world, but it is also the biggest strategic competitor. And some of the aggressive actions of China in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and in not being willing to clamp down on the umbilical cord that keeps the lights on in Pyongyang in North Korea from China, that will be very likely the crisis, I think, that will perhaps most seize the new administration and the world, should it be that North Korea seems to be on the threshold of getting a nuclear capability that could be delivered to the continental United States. I mean, we've had policy on this. There was a tweet. It said about that prospect, ain't going to happen. Sounds like a red line to me. This is the way policy is announced in these days. And so, but what then happens if indeed North Korea is on the verge, seemingly, of having that capability. And the President of the United States has to confront that most awesome of decisions, whether or not to use force to commit America's sons and daughters to harm's way. So there are a lot of, I think, of these kinds of situations where there are indeed some form of curtain, some form of threatening force, and the challenge of the future is going to be to deal with all of these simultaneously. In some respects, you know, the Cold War almost seems simple by comparison. For those of us who were on the front lines of that, we know that it was not. It was enormously threatening, you know, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons pointed in each direction, and a couple of times where it came very close, the Cuban Missile Crisis most particularly, to actually having perhaps a trigger pulled. But the complexities of the situation right now, the strains and stresses on the rules-based international order, which we did so much together with our British allies in the wake of World War II to bring into being, after 50 years in which the world saw the two most destructive world wars in our history and the worst economic depression in our history. And these institutions, the financial institutions, the international organizations, the norms, the principles, have stood the world in reasonably good stead. We have to remember, though, that these did not just spontaneously come into being, that we brought them into being. We were the midwives, and no relationship was more important than that between the United States and Great Britain. And we have to maintain this. And if there are concerns that I have when it comes to our foreign policy, one of those certainly would be whether we will continue to be the country that is willing to step forward and to lead the others, because I don't think there's any other alternative.
You, continuing on the theme of Churchill, some of the qualities that we've discussed earlier today about leadership that Winston Churchill exhibited: boldness, resilience, creativity, even openness to new ideas, alliance building. These are all important. Are we seeing those qualities in military leaders today?
Well, I think you certainly do. I think that General Mattis, now Secretary of Defense Mattis, certainly has demonstrated those. He's demonstrated them so well that people said, hey, stop being so quotable. I had the same thing said to me. Actually, it was a little less polite. You know, shut up. And I actually think, you know, one of the joys of coming out here is actually recalling again the example of this indomitable will demonstrated by Churchill, the sheer determination. You know, when I was doing the surge in Iraq, I've mentioned to people that there were certain examples that I held out. One was Ulysses S. Grant, by the way. You know, I'm going to fight it out all summer on this line if that's what it takes. And it took all summer, all fall, all winter, and all spring until April 1865 in Appomattox. But Churchill as well. Again, the ringing words, you know, perhaps from an earlier day, they wouldn't quite sound the same in today's day and age. They're probably not as easily reduced to tweets, although I do want to put forward the proposition that I think he would have been brilliant with tweets. The man would revel in social media. I think he would run laps around some of those others who have been so taken with those. But the culture of learning, the spirit of inquiry, the sheer energy and zest for life that you even see in his granddaughter, as we saw at lunch today. The inspirational leadership, the strategic thinking, but also tempered by a recognition of reality and a degree of self-deprecating humor. Even the political flexibility, something that is, you know, generally radioactive if exhibited in Washington, yet the kind of quality that we need to rediscover. That the ability to give a little to get a lot for the American people rather than holding out for everything and getting absolutely nothing. So, you know, I think all of these qualities are just absolutely extraordinary and truly inspirational. I saw one of his admonitions the other day. It said, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. I mean, it's so wonderful. I must say I have some others. There are ones that I use constantly, actually. You know, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. John stole this ahead of me on coalitions, because I commanded the largest coalition in all of history in the military in Afghanistan. And people would say, well, you know, what's it like? How onerous are coalition maintenance tasks? I say, they're hugely. I remember sitting one time and I realized, my God, you know, this Secretary of Defense and actually Prime Minister of his country is giving me less soldiers than I am giving him minutes of my time. But, you know, whatever it takes, because he was right. The only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. On the U.S., you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And then maybe my favorite, you know, if you're going through hell, keep going. You know, the Black Dog days, all of us have had reversals in life, you know, ideally not self-inflicted, but, you know, when those occur, again, it's very instructive to look back at how he made his way through this. I actually, during my own Black Dog days, I outlined a leadership book, and the title of it, the working title, was Relentless, Leadership Lessons Learned, -- Some the Hard Way. And if you think about it, I mean, this is Winston Churchill, constantly learning, constantly examining, a thirst for knowledge, this enthusiasm for life. What a tremendous example. And how wonderful to be here at a great Midwest liberal arts school that focuses on leader development in addition to the liberal arts talents and communication skills.
Well put, thank you. Shifting gears now, you've often said that one of the chief successes of the surge was not only the deployment of additional troops in Iraq, but the surge of new ideas. We're talking a little bit about this already. Can you talk about that in Iraq?
Sure.
And perhaps
Yeah.
speculate on what a new surge might look like?
Well, I think, first of all, that a new surge generally should have the contours of the original surge, if you will. In other words, it should be, in broad terms, it needs to have all of the components of the surge of 2007, 2008, a civil, military, comprehensive counterinsurgency, whatever title you want to give to the campaign. But it's going to have to be an all of the above approach. One of the paradoxes of the wars that we're fighting are that you cannot counter terrorist forces like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda with just counter-terrorist force operations. In other words, you can't just drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of this problem. You have to do much more than that. You have to clear, hold, and build. You have to live with the people. You have to reconcile. You have to deal with political grievances. You have to have reconciliation. You have then, once you've achieved security, you've got to build on it with restoration of basic services, humanitarian assistance, and all of the rest of that we sought to do and did do during the surge in Iraq. The key, again, was the surge of ideas, not the surge of forces. As important as it was to have additional forces to enable us to rapidly implement the new strategy, the real surge was the change in strategy. It was a 180-degree difference from what we were doing before, and not all components of it were completely supported or welcomed, even in some cases by the troops on the ground. We had been withdrawing to big bases, quote, getting out of the faces of the people, and handing off more rapidly to the Iraqi security force. By the way, the president and the prime minister of Iraq met in Amman, Jordan in November after the election, and they decided actually to accelerate that. I reversed every bit of it, and when the prime minister's national security advisor reminded me what the president had agreed to and what the prime minister sought to do, I said I would be very grateful if he would announce all these demands to the President of the United States on the regularly scheduled video teleconference tomorrow, at which the ambassador and I will be present as always, but he should know that if he does that, he will do it without me, because I'll be on the next plane to Washington and I intend to take the policy with me. That's a fairly big moment, by the way. It's a little bit Churchillian, Wasn't quite a world war, but it was the only war that I was in. And you know, your blood is literally flushing through your body. And of course, we go over the next day to this video conference, and I'm sitting there waiting for Prime Minister, and we never heard a thing about it again. And so we moved back into the neighborhoods. We knew that you can only secure the people by living with them. Once you're there a week or 2 weeks, then they come to you with intelligence, say, that's where the bad guy is. Now that we know you're going to be with us, we trust you to get him and keep us safe. We gradually did that. We had to fight to reestablish a lot of these. There's 77 additional locations just in the Baghdad divisional area alone. It's an enormous amount of fighting. And, you know, as Churchill said and knew, it got worse before it got better. Because when you're fighting back, when you're taking away from these insurgents and militia extremists what they fought for, they're going to fight you back. And it did, and I told Congress that ahead of time. I did try to be, you know, as John mentioned, to try to deal straight with the American people and with the Congress and with others. But I really did believe that this was going to completely turn the tide and that we would drive the violence down. We also had to promote reconciliation. Even as we went after the irreconcilables, even more with a higher operational tempo, we sought to strip away the lower level insurgents, just young men that were in the wrong place and had no alternatives from both the Sunni and the Shia. We made it even more civil military. We had an actual civil military campaign plan signed by both the ambassador and me. I used to get, you know, they said, why is there all this civilian crap in your campaign plan? I said, because it's a civil military campaign plan. That's what it has to be. So there are lots of these ideas. And again, taking back from the Iraqis what we'd handed off to them prematurely, reconstituting them. All of these were a complete reversal of what we've been doing in most of the parts of the country prior to the beginning of the surge. What I couldn't guarantee was that we were going to have sufficient results by the 6-month mark, which is when I'd agreed during my confirmation hearing. I'd had to agree that I'd come back and give a report at that time, and then later ask the ambassador to come back because it was a civil military effort. And thankfully, in the final 11 weeks prior to the report, 8 of those weeks, violence declined very dramatically with suicide bombers, civilian deaths, and other casualties having already begun to decline. And that was just enough to keep the residual support on Capitol Hill, where Senator Bond, I might add, was one of those supporters. One of the few, the proud, the final, still sticking with us, along with the 3 amigos, as we called them, Senators Lieberman, Graham, and McCain. But you have to get the big ideas right. I think strategic leaders have 4 tasks, and the most important is to get the big ideas right. This is true in business as well. I can give you examples about Netflix, how they have 4 times reinvented themselves, and also about America Online, who got it right one time but failed in the final task of leadership that I'll come to. You get the big ideas right, you communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth. I mean, people think that's easy. We had 165,000 Americans alone, another 25,000 coalition, and then even more than that total number of contractors, not out on the battlefield, but certainly still needed to understand. Then you have to oversee the execution of the big ideas. How do you spend your time? What are the metrics? How often do you get out on the battlefield yourself and feel it and experience it? What are all the mechanisms by which you do this? And then finally, often overlooked, but one near and dear to Churchill's heart, I think, was that you have to have a formal process to identify lessons that need to be learned. But they're not learned when they're identified. They're only learned when you actually change the big ideas and communicate them. You change your civil military campaign plan and you put it out. You change policies, procedures, SOPs, or whatever. America Online had a huge big idea that Americans will pay for dial-up access to the internet. It was so colossal that they actually did a merger with Time Warner. But they came down here and they couldn't get this forth. What do we do now that others are actually giving away broadband access? Why didn't they beat them to that? Kodak, great idea. New digital photography was coming, didn't change quickly enough. Netflix, on the other hand, puts Blockbuster out of business, works that all through, streams it out, works that all through, starts creating content, $100 million just on House of Cards alone, And we all know, the Brits here know, that the original House of Cards on BBC was far better than the pale carbon copy. And then most recently now doing big blockbuster productions with big stars and all the rest of that. And I do hope that Brad Pitt will play me, as he's also playing General Pitt.
We'll see. For
You'd
many
have
of
to
you
learn
know
how
that
to do more push-ups, but
many of you know Brad Pitt has a wonderful painting by Winston Churchill in his collection.
Seriously?
Wow. He was kind enough to lend it to an exhibition we had recently. So if he plays you, maybe in return you can take a painting.
Indeed, I would be happy, yes.
You've recently testified before Congress on ISIS and authored several articles on the subject. And last week, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson hosted a meeting in Washington with a global coalition to defeat the Islamic State, with representatives from 68 countries in attendance. What suggestions would you make to convince the coalition members to become more actively involved in defeating ISIS?
Well, I think what I would offer to them would be 5 lessons that I think we should have taken from the last 15 years in the Middle East and the greater war against Islamic extremists. And out of those, you'll see, will fall why they need to do something and why they should join the coalition to do it. And also, frankly, that it should be a comprehensive effort, although, as I will point out, and I should have pointed out earlier, we don't want to have to do what we did during the surge, where it had to be 165,000. That's not sustainable. What we want to do is actually what we are now doing. You can say that the previous administration was reluctant, hesitant, grudging, whatever, about getting back into Iraq, having pulled 10,000, or not allowed 10,000 troops to stay because we couldn't get a parliamentary approved status of forces agreement. But the fact is, ultimately, we did get back in. Ironically, about 6,000 without a parliamentary approved status of forces agreement, but have made great progress, and then this administration has built on that, I think, very effectively and hearteningly. But the 5 lessons are pretty straightforward. The first is that in a swath of territory from North Africa through the Sinai, the Middle East, Central South Asia, and perhaps a bit beyond, ungoverned spaces will be exploited by Islamic extremists. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how terrible is it. The second is that Las Vegas rules do not apply in these places. What happens there tragically does not stay there. Rather, it tends to spew violence and instability and extremism, and in the case of a country like Syria, a geopolitical Chernobyl meltdown, it spews refugees all the way into the countries of our NATO allies, causing the greatest political domestic challenges they've had in decades. So what that tells us is that you cannot do what we sometimes try to do in Washington, which is to admire the problem until it goes away. This one is not going away. You have to do something. And in doing something, the United States inevitably has to lead. You may get fortunate. France may do a relatively modest problem like Mali, where they have done I think, quite an impressive job, but even had to have some help with that, but commendable. But in most of these cases, the U.S. is going to have to do this, and it's quite simply because the assets that are most important in these fights, as we have now learned, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, this armada of drones and manned aircraft, the precision strike assets, and the industrial strength ability to fuse intelligence. If you take all of our possible allies and partners together and multiply times 6, you still don't have what we can field, and it's not as integratable and rationalized. So again, we're going to have to, but again, that doesn't mean you don't want to do it as a coalition. You do. Again, the great man was right. You do want to have allies, however onerous it may be, fighting together with them. And oh, by the way, we especially want Muslim country allies. This is a struggle for the heart of the Islamic world. This is more of a clash within a civilization, the Muslim world, than it is a clash between civilizations, as Sam Huntington's book at Harvard announced. So we have to have them. And by the way, that's why Muslim hate speech, that's why some other actions are counterproductive at a time when we need these different partners to help, and they need us to stand off, repel these extremist ideas. The fourth lesson that we should have learned is that it takes this comprehensive campaign, that, as I said, you can't just do it with counter-terrorist force operations. It takes all of the above. And that's why we need to fund the U.S. State Department. General Mattis, again, eminently quotable on this topic too. If you don't give me diplomats, you're going to have to give me more bullets. So cuts to the State Department on the scale that was announced drew a letter that I signed, over 100 other generals, that said we really need to relook that particular decision. And indeed, Senator Bond's former colleagues on the Capitol Hill, including the Senate Foreign Relations Chairman, Bob Corker, who is also considered for Secretary of State, will make sure they've said it's basically dead on arrival. And that's reassuring. The fifth lesson is that we have to remember and observe that this is a generational struggle. Just as the Cold War was, that was announced here at Westminster College by the last lion, this is going to be the struggle of not just a decade, much less a few years. It's going to be many decades. I've said for 2 years or more that we would defeat the Islamic State in Iraq. Even in the worst days, I never had any doubts that once we got over there, started enabling our Iraqi counterparts, that they would be able to reconstitute, retrain, re-equip, and take the fight back to the enemy. And they've done just that, and it's just the old city of Mosul, now a city I know well from having spent a year of my life there as a 2-star general, that is left to be liberated. That's never been in question in my mind. The question is the battle after the battle. Can there then be inclusive politics that will prevent the creation of fields that are fertile for the planting of the seeds of extremism and the rise of ISIS 3.0? But we're going to be at this for a long time. We'll put a stake through the heart of ISIS, the army, probably a Baghdadi, the leader, but we cannot put a stake through the ideology, particularly the ideological caliphate, even after the geographic caliphate is taken away, especially in a world where social media and the internet are areas that are so difficult to counter, although we're getting better with machine learning. But the idea that this is a generational struggle tells us that we have to have sustainable strategies. And that is why it is revolutionary what we're doing in Iraq now. We're with 6,000 or 7,000 soldiers on the ground. We're enabling another country's forces to clear their country of Islamic extremists, obviating the need for the 165,000 that I mentioned during the surge. And sustainability at the end of the day is measured in 2 metrics. It's blood and it's treasure. And what we have figured out how to do now, because there was enough left from our efforts in the past, is to enable a country's host nation forces support its political leaders so that they can do all the other tasks that are required, because they still are required. Somebody has to do them, but ideally not us, because we want to keep the cost down, obviously in terms of blood, but also in terms of what we have to spend in terms of dollars and cents. And we've been able to do this, and that is hugely important. Now, so why does Secretary Tillerson tell them? It says because we have to do something. This is causing enormous problems for you and for other like-minded nations. U.S. will lead, but we need all of you doing this with us. And oh, by the way, while he's at it, of course, he'll remind them about the commitment made by the leaders of the NATO countries at a recent summit where they agreed to spend 2% of their GDP, and that he needs to see the plans for them to do that. I think that's a legitimate request. By the way, talking about sustainability, people say, oh my gosh, this could take years. How many years have we had tens of thousands of troops on European soil? How many years have we had tens of thousands of troops on Korean soil? This is sustainable if you get it down in terms of blood and treasure. And mentioned, have some of the determination of the great man.
You mentioned the internet. In a world where cyber conflict threatens, what would be the consequence of a cyber war? And is it happening, or how can it be avoided?
Well, I think among the threats that are most significant out there, and again, you'd have to list the threats. You know, you've got these revisionist powers, again, as I listed earlier, Russia, Iran, North Korea, even China, again, both a partner and a competitor. You have Islamic extremists as a category, Al-Qaeda as well as the Islamic State and their affiliates. You have cyber threats. And here, I'm not just worried about nation-state cyber threats, countries stealing $1 trillion of our intellectual property or meddling in our elections, perhaps trying to influence them, certainly to try to undermine the faith of the American people and other democratic countries, peoples in their democratic systems. I'm not just worried about cyber crime, which is ever more diabolically clever. I'm worried about cyber extremists in cyberspace. If you have Islamic extremists who are willing to blow themselves up, to be suicide bombers, to take you with them, what would deter them from using the cyber equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction? And those do exist. It would be shutting down the electrical grid of the eastern United States. It's publicly been known that nation states have done cyber reconnaissance in our electrical grid, water systems, the industrial control systems, the so-called SCADA systems, are generally fairly old, do not have necessarily Silicon Valley IT talent running them in all cases. And this is an area of enormous urgency, frankly. But as we think through this, the problem has been that all of this has developed so rapidly, certainly in comparison to the evolution of nuclear weapons deterrence theory, where you basically started out and one country has the A bomb at the time, then the Russians get it, so you have two countries and a few more allies get it. I mean, this is a fairly finite problem, and you have decades during which the wizards of Armageddon, as these nuclear strategists were termed, could craft their very intricate and nuanced theories of mutual assured destruction and counterstrike and second strike and all the rest of this. This is developing so rapidly, and it's exploding in its effect. Now we have the Internet of Things, something I talked about as a CIA director in Silicon Valley some 4 years ago, and said this is a whole new universe, really. And we've already seen that the lack of cybersecurity on many of these devices, which are quite simple and straightforward, rushed into the marketplace, can be hacked very easily, hijacked, and then used for massive denial of services attacks, one of which shut down one of the big internet switchboards, if you will, not too long ago. So again, there are enormous concerns here, and we've got to, with as much urgency as we can, add to the legislation that we have, build the capabilities of the Department of Homeland Security, which has now been designated as the quarterback for response on the national level, but also get the ideas straight on how can we best deter, how can we best sanction, punish, respond to these, and make sure that the other side understands that if they can do something to us, we can do it to them, presumably even better, except for this group of extremists that might not care and may not have a return address. That's a much more diabolically difficult problem.
A humbling one.
It is.
I'm going to have one more question, and we'll have a brief period for some questions from the audience. And that is a topic that is making headlines every day, it seems, or every hour, about Russian interference in our elections. You know, one of the key elements of a democracy is having free and fair elections. And the United States intelligence community officially concluded that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 elections, including hacking and various forms of disinformation. How should the United States respond to this interference, and what measures can we do to prevent it?
Sure, and I think we're still, in a lot of ways, formulating the response. Certainly we have at least put them on notice. That was done. You might argue that it could have been done more early on, and it might have been done more publicly early on so that the American public also understood what was going on. Certainly there need to be financial sanctions, perhaps even arrest warrants as has been done in some cases against some Chinese individuals. But again, people have to understand, individual people have to understand that we will be able to track them down, we will be able to identify them, and they will pay a price for this. Now you may say, hey, this individual doesn't want to travel to Europe, he's not worried about a vacation in Miami Beach or something like that. You'd be surprised at how stifling these kinds of sanctions can be if they are fully enforced and they begin to go after those who do business with these who are sanctioned and so forth. So that's important. I think actually having more dialogue on these issues is actually very important. China ultimately did tone it back a bit after confrontation with President Obama. There needs to be more of that, and there's going to have to be more of that with other countries as well. And then frankly, we do have to do what I mentioned earlier, which is dramatically improve, again, the legal foundation for actions, the resources provided to the Department of Homeland Security in particular, an organization that has not yet shown the kind of magnetic attraction that, say, the CIA or the NSA has for individuals. I mean, people say, well, why would somebody go from Silicon Valley to NSA or CIA? The answer is very simple. They can do something that's illegal and not end up in jail for it. It's pretty awesome. And then there is this sort of attraction of I had this thing, it was called, I tried all these different experiments to get to know the workforce. I'm the guy that comes in. I had a pretty high level, entry level position at the CIA. I did take the uniform off, left all my people behind, and went in. So I sought a number of venues to sort of get to know the troops, if you will. And so we had one that was offered early on, run with the director. You could come run with me. The problem was, we sort of created a bar that you had to get over to be able to run. You had to do 6 miles in 42 minutes or something like that, just to make sure that you could, it wasn't going to be a heat casualty. And so that wasn't a real, I really got to know all the college interns out there. So we tried a couple of other things. I had work out with the director. It wasn't a particularly big hit. And so then we hit on eat with the director, and we had all hands went up, and we'd go down to the cafeteria, and at sit down, we had 4 people, was always the size. We tried to get mid-level stars of the future there. And so you always had a stock series of questions, and so I sat down, and one of the guys is over here, and I said, so tell me, where do you work in the building? He said, director, I refuse to work in the building. I said, oh, really? Okay. I said, well, what's your job title? He said, I refuse to have a job title too. I said, really? He said, hey, director, look, here's the deal. I built and sold 4 startups out in Silicon Valley. My family is good to go for the next 4 or 5 generations. I always wanted to serve in the CIA. I know that you have a problem now in this brave new cyberspace world that we have with traditional tradecraft. You can't do what you used to do because you just can't use a fake passport and get away with that. You've got biometrics that your fingerprints taken and eyeball scans and all the rest of this. I'm going to help you work through these issues. And I said, well, fantastic. Where are you doing it from? He said, I rented myself an office over in Pentagon City, I think is where it was. And I said, good on you, but you get that kind for the CIA and the NSA. And I'm hoping we'll see more and more of that for DHS, because that is now the central point that will guide the response, given the Snowden revelations that made it a little bit more difficult for NSA to do some of the tasks that we had envisioned them doing in a more hopeful future.
Well, thank you. I'd like to, we are in a timeline here, and we have a number of
know
things
that we are all that stands between you and getting your book signed by John Meacham.
But I think we will take a couple of questions from the audience. If I could ask for those of you...
If you can come on up to the microphone here, if that's possible. You certainly, yes, but we have the microphone here, if you can. Okay, sure. It's a great question because, of course, we had a very significant issue during the surge, as you may recall, with one of the security contractors who, very murky circumstances, but without question, did kill I think it was over 10 Iraqi civilians. And it caused a huge uproar, as you would appreciate and understand. And there is actually very considerable oversight of them by the military in a theater of war. I had enormous authority, and I must confess that I exercised it much more rigorously in the wake of that. We had visibility on where they were at all times. We had liaison officers in our operations center. We had liaison in theirs. They actually come under the authority legally of the commander in a situation like that. The rules of engagement had to be approved by, and again, there was a very extensive degree of coordination. And I hope that we can continue that, because this is hugely important. If there are people outside the wire that can pull the trigger, we need to make sure that they're obviously pulling the trigger only when it is absolutely necessary, because the results of this can be, as we say, non-biodegradable. They are never going away, and those are big problems. A little bit like the situation in Abu Ghraib, the images of which will haunt us forever. So you've got to get those kinds of potential issues sorted out in advance. Please.
General Petraeus.
It's on.
General Petraeus, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today.
Privilege.
My name is Jonathan Lee. I'm a security studies major here at Westminster, and I'm a junior. I have kind of a three-part question, and I'm hoping, if you can't answer all of it, I understand. The first part of my question is, when you were director of the CIA, what was the most challenging part of working in the intelligence community in your mind? That may be a hard question to boil down into as much time as we have, but my second question is, what in your mind was your greatest success within the CIA, and what was the agency's greatest success during your tenure there? And my third question is, what attributes and what qualities make an individual suitable for being an ideal intelligence professional within the intelligence community today?
Great. Thanks. Are you at all considering going to the CIA by any chance?
Potentially.
Terrific. Well, I am, doubly blessed, I guess, to be able to lead soldiers in combat, and then also to lead our intelligence officers in what I believe is just an extraordinary national asset, a jewel of the intelligence community, needless to say, the CIA. Let me start with, the question about what was the greatest success at the CIA, and the answer to that is quite simple. I can't talk about it. Others have. You can read about it in the memoirs if you look in the right places of perhaps Leon Panetta or Hillary Clinton, but otherwise. In the military, I was just so obviously privileged to, again, as was mentioned, to have any command really in any level is the most awesome of privileges and responsibilities. To have 6 of them as a general officer in a row, and 5 of which were in combat, was really pretty special, to put it mildly. But I think at the end of the day, you sort of go back and look at the surge. And, for me, I think this is sort of like, standing on the beaches for Winston Churchill. It's one of those moments that sort of defines. And, I would offer on that as a general comment, but also as you prepare to embark on whatever career you select. People say sometimes that, Petraeus was lucky, he just seemed to always be around when things were really desperate, and they weren't as desperate as they seemed, and sort of he went in and sort of made a couple good speeches and gave an interview or two, and it all turned around, or what have you. Again, but it was luck. I'm one who believes that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And again, when you think of Churchill and you think of that moment where he had said he'd been preparing his entire life for that moment. And I must confess, I was always in such a blur as one of these new opportunities came along that I didn't sit back and say that to myself, but inside, that was true. I mean, I really worked very, very hard to understand the profession and did a dissertation on military advice and the use of force in the post-Vietnam era, which meant you had to look at it the pre-Vietnam. And, you know, always focusing, everything always trying to build the intellectual capital and the big ideas that could be the foundation for actions if indeed that opportunity comes along. So I really am a big believer in that. I'll tell you, I mean, we're all a little bit quirky, but I remember I was in the UK, in fact. I was with the parachute regiment. I was an airborne officer as a lieutenant. And we were over there jumping with the parachute regiment. And so we had an afternoon off, and the lieutenant said, well, you want to, we can go downtown to Aldershot here or something like that. I said, yeah, I'd like to go to your military sales store. He said, well, what are you looking for? I said, well, I'd like to get a little field marshal's baton. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, remember Napoleon said every soldier carries a field marshal's baton in his rucksack, and I want to be ready when the call comes. Now, this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, except that we did go in, and I did actually ask, do you have any field marshal's batons? And the guy said, oh, fresh out, mate, but we have this little swagger stick. And so I actually bought the swagger stick, and I tied it very carefully to the frame of my rucksack. It was not all that visible, but it was visible to me. And it was a reminder to me, every time I looked at it, put it on my back, got ready to road march or go into combat, that by God, you're constantly preparing. You never can stop preparing. And I think, again, Churchill dedicated his life to that kind of inquiry to the very, very end. What do you look for in an intelligence professional? I think that you're looking for someone, especially if it's the CIA, who is willing to be a silent warrior, someone who recognizes up front that you're not going to have public ceremonies. There's no, I had this wonderful retirement ceremony when I took the final pass in the review, as they say, as a general officer. They don't get that. I mean, at most, there's a little ceremony inside. Maybe their family gets to come once or twice, but usually not. Sometimes, they go home every night and they're denied that wonderful pleasure that so many of us revel in, which is, so what did you do at the office today, dear? And, he has to say, well, I can't tell you. You're not cleared for that. Or the neighbors can't even know that that you work at the other State Department. They all work at the, quote, State Department. Everybody knows they don't, but they can't talk about that. So there's a certain something in there that you have to really want to serve your country. You're looking for people that have enormous initiative and scope for initiative in tough spots that they can figure out how do we get ourselves out of this fix that we've gotten into. Creativity. I think the willingness to speak truth to power, to do it politely, not in a confrontation, not the kinds of blow-ups that you see on Covert Affairs or these other series about the CIA or Homeland or something like that, which is so fanciful as to defy any description. But those qualities, I think, are hugely important. In addition, needless to say, to brains, work ethic, integrity, all the other qualities that I think you would look for in people. And by the way, what I think actually for the students that are here, people constantly ask, so what should I do to get ready for X, Y, or Z? And again, there are all the trite ones about, study hard, get all A's, do this, be the president of this, do that, all the right things. In addition to that, I'd say seek out of your intellectual comfort zone experiences. Do something that is really off the wall. Go to civilian graduate school instead of going to the Ranger Regiment. I had that choice and thankfully had a mentor at the time who said, have you ever thought about raising your sights a little bit above the maximum effective range of a machine gun? I said, why would I want to do that? No, I didn't. And it was very, very fortunate because for me, going to a civilian graduate school was a mind-blowing experience. It taught me intellectual humility. I learned that there are seriously, seriously bright people in this world who don't see it through the same lens that I see it through, who have the basic assumptions about the, quote, state of nature, to use the political science term. Is it Hobbesian? Is it in the absence of the Leviathan, is it nasty, brutish, and short? or is it sort of the Lockean, we would all sit around and hug each other and sing Kumbaya? So again, having that kind of experience, travel for me has always been among those kinds of experiences. Every time I've had a chance, I've gone as an infantryman, I went to the Armor Advanced Course. Instead of the War College, I did a fellowship. And I was told several times, especially when I went to graduate school, you are committing professional suicide instead of going back to an infantry unit. And somehow I seemed to manage to survive, at least for a while. So I would commend all of that to you if I could. Thanks.
Well,
Thank you so much.
General Petraeus, and thank all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Could you hand me that sheet that's on the lectern? General Petraeus, we have some wonderful mementos of your time here back at Westminster College as we do. This is your ticket back.
My ticket back.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
A ticket from the 1946 March 5th Iron Curtain speech.
Terrific.
Admit one.
Was yours framed, John? Not that I'm competitive or anything.
And there's another.
Thank you for
one
that.
other thing. Yes, there's
As
one
you're
other
doing
thing.
that, actually, it is I who thanks you, because you all have preserved something that is hugely important, not just for this great college, but for our great country and for the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. And I thank you for that. Oh, lovely. Fantastic. Thank you.
And this, of course, is a print by Edwina Sands of her grandfather.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Edwina.
I'd like to invite everyone. There will be a book signing with John Meacham and a reception in the undercroft of the museum straight down below. Please, I encourage you all to go down. And once again, thank you for being with us for this Churchill Fellows Weekend. Thank you again.